Welcome to this webinar of the Gerhard Center webinar series, The Aftermath of COVID-19, the New Social Impact Ecosystem. Today, we're very honored to have with us speakers Annabel Short. She's a senior advisor, built environment at the Institute of Human Rights and Business. And also Yahia Shawkat, who's the co-founder of 10 Tooba, Ashra Tooba, a housing and spatial justice research audio. The webinar elevates the human rights dimension throughout the built environment life cycles, from land acquisition, planning, policy, and finance, through design, construction, and use of redevelopment. Outcomes are determined by the balance of power and responsibilities for decision making. The webinar will hone in on participation and non-discrimination, the social roles of architects and urban planners, workers' rights, and the right to housing, among other aspects. The first part will bring a global overview. This is Annabel Short, while the second part takes a deeper dive into the context of Egypt. This is Yahia Shawkat, highlighting challenges and recommendations for the path forward. Let me tell you briefly about both of our speakers. Annabel has 2 decades of experience advocating for strong human rights and environmental conduct by business. She has combined international work, leading regional programs with colleagues in Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, with local level coalitions, building in New York City, where she lives in Queens with her husband and 2 sons. Yahia Shawkat is an urban researcher and a co-founder of the research studio 10 Tooba. He is editor of its Built Environment Observatory, an open knowledge portal advocating housing and spatial justice. Yahia has worked with civil society and international agencies on affordable housing strategies, and is the author of a recent book, AUC Press. The book is Egypt's Housing Crisis, the Shaping of Urban Space. His work includes the Built Environment Depreciation Index, Why Do Buildings Collapse in Egypt, and the Right to Housing Initiative. Now, without much ado, I mean, the rules like every other engagement, every other webinar we had. I'm gonna let Annabel first talk about the global view. She's gonna have about 20-25 minutes, and then Yahia will talk for another 20 or so minutes, 20-25 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A. So, Annabel, floor is yours, my dear.
Thank you, Ali. I'm gonna also open up some visuals to guide me through these 20 minutes on human rights and the built environment life cycle. And it's so wonderful to see so many people on this live stream and so much interest in this topic, which for me, through the combination of my international human rights work and then local level advocacy here in New York City, as you'll see in the slides that follow, have become increasingly convinced of the importance for action on this topic. So it's really wonderful to see so much interest from you all. I think many of the people on this call are already architects. And so if you are, you're very familiar with what on earth we mean when we say built environment, but I'm also aware that for people outside the built environment space, that term can be pretty meaningless. So in terms of what we're actually talking about, we're talking about buildings and infrastructure. And by buildings, so real estate investments and real estate as it manifests itself, and also infrastructure. So the homes we live in, the offices we work in, hotels and tourism, cultural institutions. On the infrastructure side, ports, transit, energy infrastructure, special economic zones. So it's a big subject. At the same time, it's also a profession of people who work within the built environment sectors, who wear all kinds of different hats. And as you'll see through this presentation, I think the more collaboration and interaction that there is between actors in the built environment and those who are impacted by it, the better. So there are planners, government policymakers, there are investors, architects and designers, builders and engineers, lawyers, technologists, and others as well. And then I think the third dimension that I'll bring in is also when we think about built environment, where do we actually experience it? So in the places where we live, the places where we work, and then also out on the streets, going about our lives in the community. This quote I came across in the thesis by a guy called Wang Qi, Towards the Built Environment Linguistics. I'm also fascinated by language, so it drew my attention, and I feel for me captures why I'm so interested in this area. So clearly the built environment surrounds us and affects us every day. It's the biggest and most complicated artificial product of human being and changes the surface of our planet. And that last point, as you'll see as I go forward, is fundamental, that we're thinking both of the actual impact on the planet and on the sort of future survivability of the planet, as well as our future survivability and present experience as human beings. Just to hone in on some of the statistics, to highlight the scale of what we're thinking about here. So on the climate side, buildings are currently responsible for almost 40% of global carbon emissions. That's in terms of through the materials that go into building them, the process of building them, and then the energy use once they're in use, and for 50% of extracted materials. At the same time, Green Building Council and others have projected that by 2060, the total global floor area of buildings on the Earth's surface will double, which is pretty mind-boggling, and I think re-emphasizes the importance of using existing buildings that are already there but maybe sitting vacant, which we'll touch on a bit later too. On the finance side, real estate in its broadest sense accounts for about 60% of global assets. And then in terms of where people are living, as many of you will know, there's rapid urbanization of the world. So 2/3 of the world's population is projected to live in urban areas by 2060. So what do human rights have to do with all of this? These are people who are currently holding different mandates at the UN level on human rights, and we brought together some of them recently on the topic of human rights in the built environment in the context of the COVID crisis. And I think what's really striking is that all of these UN mandate holders, so Tlaleng Mafogang, who's the UN Rapporteur on the Right to Health, for example, Balakrishnan Goprajal, who's the Rapporteur on the Right to Housing, and these other mandates all saw how pertinent human rights in the built environment was to their mandates. On the health side, one of the key things that was lifted up is the way in which, yes, COVID is a respiratory illness, but there are also predeterminants of health. So people who are already living in crowded conditions without access to adequate sanitation, or living in crowded prison cells or complexes, people who were juggling multiple jobs and had to be out physically in their workplaces, obviously were at higher risk than those who had more space and ability to shelter in place at home, and so on and so forth. On the housing side, another element to lift up was the fragility that many people faced in terms of economic shutdowns and not being able to pay their rent, and many, increase in the homelessness crisis and people not having an adequate place to live. So when we're thinking of a human rights approach, I think the previous slide lifted up the breadth of human rights. Often when I'm speaking with built environment professionals, I think the mind goes to workers' rights through construction supply chains, for example, which is a key piece of the picture, or the human rights record of client governments, for example. Both of them are key pieces of the picture, but I think it's important to think of the interdisciplinary nature of human rights and the fact it includes economic, social, cultural rights, such as health, housing, as well as civil and political rights. And cross-cutting throughout the whole of the human rights framework are these key principles around participation and agency, non-discrimination, accountability, and transparency. Another key element I think I'll lift up here is the solid grounding in international human rights law, which is extremely powerful when we're calling for accountability in the built environment around what are the actual duties on state actors, and at the same time, what are the recognized responsibilities of non-state actors? Some of you might be familiar, for example, with the UN's Protect, Respect, and Remedy framework, which sets out the way in which state duties and corporations' responsibilities interact with each other. And then it has a third pillar of the right to remedy for when abuses occur. So I'm going to have two different circle diagrams that I introduce over the coming slides. So this is the first one, based on a report I wrote and now the program that I'm leading with Institute for Human Rights and Business on the built environment lifecycle. And the idea is saying through every stage of the built environment lifecycle, if we're thinking about it in project terms, there are opportunities both to cause harm to human rights that need to be mitigated, but then also opportunities for really opening up the space for the realization of rights. Just before we go into the separate sections of this life cycle, flagging that there are 2 points about it. It's a useful way to think about human rights impacts throughout the built environment. And yet it's key to emphasize the importance of early action. In any project at any scale, the ability to actually influence outcomes is much greater at the earlier stage of the process, when the plan for the project's being developed, RFPs are being created, contracts, etc., than further down. So the more the government and finance and owners, actors at the outset of the life cycle, can be really thinking from a human rights lens right from the beginning, the better. And another key piece to highlight here is that this life cycle is obviously a long one. And again, that's where the power of the built environment is so clear, is that management and use phase, stage 5 of a building or a place, can last for 50, 100, even more years. This is a whistle-stop tour of human rights issues at each stage, so there's no way that I'm going to do it justice. So I encourage you all to dig in deeper to the report afterwards. But obviously, at the core of human rights in the built environment, the land stage is fundamental in terms of access to land, cost of land, the growing pressures, for example, on urban land, which then are pushing up prices and impacting areas such as the right to housing. And then also due process, going back to human rights standards in terms of land acquisition. So there are very established frameworks around what due process and consultation and compensation look like in land acquisition. At the planning and finance phase, so for now staying relatively broad in terms of wider planning of urban areas, I thought I would just highlight this one story of a woman who lives here, where I live in New York City, whose journey to work for looking after a disabled man at his home in the care industry can take her up to 3 hours on a bus each day. And while you might not think necessarily that that's a question of planning, it's very much connected in terms of where is housing built in relation to jobs, are people connected to transit connections, and so on. Another key piece I'd like to lift up at the planning phase, when we're thinking of master plans, I think we're seeing a lot of attention at the moment around cities for the future and smart cities. You just had big architects joining in with a billionaire here in the US planning a new city, Nevada, for 5 million people. Or you have the plan for NEOM in Saudi Arabia, for example. A huge amount of attention going to these visions, but what I'd like to really lift up is who are they for, number one, and how much money and energy is going into thinking about these new visions of the future, as opposed to thinking about the major challenges of the present, and how those can be addressed as we design the future and address and deal with design questions. So then the top half of that slide highlights the ways in which planning decisions in the past have really kind of built in segregation into the fabric of the built environment where we live. At the design phase, I'll get into this a little further on as well, but I think a key aspect to lift up is really the potentiality of design when it really takes into account the end users of the building and then ideally the communities who live around them. And this is an example of a tuberculosis treatment center in Haiti designed by Mass Design, who have become experts in designing hospitals with patients and end users' experience of those hospitals in mind. And just quite what a difference design that really thinks of lifting people up can make in terms of realization of rights such as the right to health. At the same time, the importance of thinking beyond the parameters of the actual building. So for example, in this case, they realized that it's not just a question of the experience of the patients, but then where are the visitors' families to these hospitals going to be staying if they're traveling long distances and needing to think in a holistic sense around design decisions and people's interaction with a space. On the construction side, so what I could have shared here are maybe the hard edge of human rights impacts of construction when it goes wrong, and really recognizing that given the tight margins in the construction industries and high levels of competition, the challenges in terms of making the space to ensure that basic standards such as structural safety are adhered to. And, examples of that would include Grenfell disaster in the UK, the recent collapse of the building in Miami, even the Rana Plaza factory collapse in Bangladesh, which is often associated with workers' rights in the garment industry as fundamental issue of building structural safety, and then people who are being warned about risks not addressing them in time. So that's one of the challenging sides of construction. At the same time, I'd also really want to lift up, similarly to a design, the huge amounts of potential here. So this is a picture from Women Build Nations Conference, which happens every year, and the opportunity for the construction industries to be both innovating in terms of new approaches to the built environment with human rights in mind, but then obviously thinking about how do we create more opportunities for people who've faced barriers to work in construction and ensure that workers through our supply chain, material supply chain, aren't being exploited or in situations of forced labor. As I flagged, the fifth stage, management and use, is maybe the largest and longest, and yet sometimes, especially if we apply a life cycle approach, doesn't get the attention that it ought to. And it's interesting that some construction and engineering companies are increasingly sort of expanding the remit of their roles to think about the usability and adaptability of a building well beyond when they've actually finally finalized the construction phase. So roles throughout the whole life cycle of a building, once it's in use, to be thinking about, are we really maximizing the experience of this place for the people who use it and for the people, large workforces who are involved in both the cleaning and maintenance of buildings. And then finally, and this links back to the first stage of the life cycle, thinking about demolition and redevelopment. What are the opportunities for actually reusing the materials within a building? Is it necessary to demolish in the first place? And linking right back to the access of land in this process, what's being demolished? What's the process? How is it impacting the people who are living in that space? Another key element I would like to lift up is that as we're thinking about human rights in the built environment, it's really important to think of the ways in which climate action and social action are fundamentally connected. Some on this call might have been involved in recent, investor conversations with growing attention on ESG, environmental, social, and governance investment. And surprisingly, given the interconnection between the two, those two worlds can act very much in silos. And so while there's rapidly growing awareness of the climate impacts of the built environment and how buildings need to be decarbonized and how resilience to rising sea levels needs to happen, I would make a very strong case for thinking about the ways in which those processes also have human rights dimensions. For example, as the process of building buildings in more energy efficient ways advances, what are the implications for construction workers and their jobs and the opportunities for reskilling into newer and greener construction processes, for example? Or as buildings are retrofitted and decarbonized, are there risks, which we've seen in many countries, of that pushing prices up and exacerbating access to housing for the people who need it the most? And what financing models, therefore, can counteract those risks? So it's a broad agenda. And I think one of the key points to lift up is the fact that anyone who's working in this space has intervention points. No one person can take on this full agenda by themselves. There are big silos between actors which need to be broken down, but each person who's engaging in a different way with the built environment has certain contexts and certain ways in which they can make interventions to advance respect for human rights. And I'm working with IHRB and then three partners, Raoul Wallenberg Institute, RAFTO Foundation, and the Australian Human Rights Institute, on a coalition which is working in three very practical ways to advance this agenda. One is on a policy track. So to give two examples, saying within Green Building Council certifications, which, as I mentioned, often focus on the environmental side, how do you strengthen the social provisions? Or as the European Union develops a taxonomy to define sustainable investment, how do we ensure that the human rights provisions within that taxonomy are strong? And obviously on the government side, how can accountability for human rights impacts be strengthened. At the level of projects, and that's where I'd say to anyone working in architecture or engineering who's on this call and who's interested in joining in with this on this, we're working with municipalities and others within the industry in terms of how do we take the framework of human rights throughout the built environment and actually apply it in the context of specific projects and share examples and lessons learned out along the way, recognizing it's never easy, but the more practical insights we have, the better that is in terms of a snowball effect. And underpinning that is engagement such as this, research, bringing people together across the silos, and aiming to also inspire leadership of the future in terms of engaging schools of architecture and engineering. And we have a framework that sits behind the program, which is not a new framework, I always emphasize, but sets out the life cycle as I described it, demonstrating what are the actual, what's a high-level vision for action in that area? What are the existing human rights standards and sustainable development goals? What are some targeted questions to prompt thinking and action at that stage of the life cycle? And what are some examples of people who are getting it right? So moving on to the second circle I said I would use, which is another way of thinking about how to drive change in the built environment, is who has leverage. And as I mentioned before on the life cycle of human rights impacts, it's very much those at the earlier stages of the cycle, the government regulatory framework, and the investors in terms of where the money's coming from, and owners of projects who really have the ultimate sway over decision making. And so as we've worked with construction and architectural companies, that in a way was the whole impetus for this program, saying, great, we're going to try and do what we can, but until we get these others on board, our influence is limited. Just going to hone in on what this looks like for a few of these actors in terms of specific leverage points. And throughout all of them, I think a good, simple way to think about this is, to what extent are decisions that are being made close to impacted people on the ground and connected to their needs, and particularly the most vulnerable? So when we think back to the UN Rapporteur on the rights of people with disabilities or older persons, who's impacted by this project? Are they being heard? And how is the project avoiding risks to them and maximizing positive outcomes vis-a-vis distance and extraction? In terms of, for example, we'll get onto it in a second with the finance sector. If you have decisions that are made that are far, far, far removed from the impacts from the ground, it becomes really challenging to bring a human rights lens. On the government side, I would just lift up from a human rights perspective how interesting it's been and how important it is that traditionally there's a conception of national governments when we think about human rights and what are the duties of national governments in terms of their policies, but particularly in the built environment, but in so many areas too. Obviously, it's municipal governments that are closest to people in their daily lives. So how can local government policy all the way up to national and regional policy be making it easier to respect human rights in the built environment? And then obviously the other roles of government being in the space of public procurement, huge procurement heft in terms of which companies are contracted and how can those contract processes embed stronger respect for human rights. And as we saw earlier on the planning side. On finance side, thinking of the arrow to connected to distance, this is a simplified way to really be thinking about the different types of financial flows into the built environment, and the ways in which they can either be increasing human rights risks or creating an environment more conducive to respecting human rights. So you could have community control, such as community land trusts and community-owned properties, for example, place-based impact investing, which is hugely on the rise in multiple regions, which is a really encouraging and important development, I'd say, provided that the place itself where that investing is happening is actively engaged in shaping how that investment happens, and that it doesn't deviate too much into a top-down approach. Responsible and sustainable investing, ESG standards, etc., as I highlighted earlier, the key role that our program is trying to play here is to say, what does that mean in a practical sense for the built environment industries? And again, often I think those conversations can sit up here or even at the level of, does this company have a policy? Tick, cross. And it's really, really important for investors to be leaning in and thinking, okay, what are the geographical regions that we're channeling this real estate finance into? What are the ripple-on effects of the way that finance is flowing? And how do we really engage, roll up our sleeves and work with trade unions, with civil society and other organizations, and really making those investments sustainable and responsible? Standard investment, I'd say so much of the wider financial landscape these days actually does have elements of sustainability and ESG standards. And if you think, for example, of development banks and who they want to finance, but important to be breaking down the different types of actors there, banks, asset managers, and others, and highlighting, again, the ways that their finance is channeled into the built environment in different ways. The last tier, there was only space on the slide for 5 rows, otherwise I would have put them separate because they are slightly different, but I'm highlighting what can be almost at the hardest end, human rights wise, in terms of finance into the built environment. If it's purely speculative in terms of aiming to make as much return as possible, but with no engagement on what the ripple effects on the ground might be, or at the furthest extreme, which continues to be pervasive in all regions, is actually using real estate for money laundering purposes. Lifting up some of the bright side here, on the architect side, I think it's really striking the role that architects play in a way as an interlocutor between end users and the places they're designing and project owners and financial flows. So really think that there's an absolutely critical role for leadership amongst the architectural community. And it's been striking to see just over the last few years the way in which some of the major prizes in architecture have recognized that broader social role for architecture. So for example, the Sterling Prize in the UK in 2019 went to Goldsmith Street, which is a public housing development with very high energy efficiency standards. The Global Pritzker Award this year went to this couple from Paris whose ethos is never to demolish, with a real focus on redesigning, rethinking, but with minimal interventions, existing buildings to make them better for people. And they've worked again on social housing projects, art institutions, and elsewhere. And then perhaps the most surprising one being a Pulitzer for investigative journalism, that went to a woman who worked together with journalists to use her architectural skills to track where are the, what's the infrastructure of the forced prison labor camps for Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in the Xinjiang province of China. And that investigation, which combined both the on-the-ground reporting with her architectural skills, led to them winning a Pulitzer for that work. Finally, on the construction and engineering side, highlighting the importance of collective action where possible through business associations by companies in these sectors, and also the interesting trend that I highlighted before of saying, okay, let's think beyond the parameters of this actual project that we're delivering, but can we pitch up to clients for a broader role through the life cycle of the building? So opportunities for construction and engineering firms to be advocating up, as it were, to potential clients, and of course embedding respect for human rights downwards through their supply chains and in their subcontracts with those who are delivering the project. And I would be remiss as the last sector and an area of action to lift up if I didn't hone in also on the role of technology. Yes, in the growing space of smart cities, but actually in any built environment project now, technology firms are playing a growing role. And there again, that's where the human rights framework of protect and respect and remedy really kicks in and needs to be implemented. Number one, in terms of potential infringements to the right to privacy, but then much wider within the smart city agenda, I think needs to be that question of participation that I lifted up at the beginning, like how is this project being developed, who for, and how are people able to actually shape the project so it's connected to what they need. And a really striking example of a company facing a backlash in that area was Sidewalk Labs, when it had a big plan for the waterfront area of Toronto. And I think the pace at which that plan was developed led to concerns both of overreach by one single company over a space, risks around the right to housing, and then definite concerns over the ways in which smart technologies ostensibly to improve energy efficiency could actually be harnessed in ways that undermine people's human rights to privacy, freedom of expression, and otherwise. So, as I flagged at the beginning, a big agenda where everyone, however, has an opportunity to lean in and really push boundaries. This is the foundational report for our program, so do go and download that. This is 2 areas where you can find some of my own sort of work and thinking on human rights and on the role of business and corporate accountability. Rights here and its material. And there is my email address. So whether it's wanting to roll up sleeves and collaborate on a specific project or to get engaged on the project policy side of the work, really encourage you to get in touch. And looking forward to hearing what Yahia has to say next.
Thank you, Annabel. We'll go now with Yahia. He's going to talk also 25 minutes, 30 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for Q&A. Yahia, floor is yours, my dear.
Okay, thank you.
Do you have slides you want to share, or you just?
Yes, I'm about to get them going.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Ali, for this opportunity to speak. I think this is a very key issue, and thank you, Annabel, for this excellent overview. I think my talk on Egypt will mesh in nicely with your introduction. I'll just share my screen. We can get going. Can you see it well?
Yep.
Perfect.
Okay. So first, a little overview on the work we do at Tooba. We've founded in 2014 with my partner Ahmed Zaza, and since then we've worked on a number of built environment issues. Our flagship project is really the Built Environment Observatory, which is a portal of open knowledge on housing and spatial justice issues. We've worked before on the Built Environment Deprivation Index, where we were able to track down 6 main components of housing inadequacy in Egypt and pinpoint them. At the local levels, not just the national level. Topic today. Egypt happens to be the biggest per capita housing producer in the world. It's about the 3rd or 4th in absolute numbers. Of course, China and in absolute numbers, of course, India far outstrip our production. At least a mathematical point of view, we shouldn't have a housing crisis. However, we find out that millions of people do live in inadequate housing, and this is a form of invisible homelessness, where people do have shelter, but it's inadequate shelter, either lacks proper access to water, to sanitation, homes are crowded, or on the verge of collapse. And this happens to be the case where the adequate homes that we see an overproduction of are unaffordable and out of reach of many. Focusing here on, the housing problem or the housing crisis is, of course, linked to many issues, which are too complex to get into all of them. So today I'd like to focus on the architect. Here we have the glorified image of the fictitious Howard Rourke from Rand's The Fountainhead, where he is thought to have been modeled on Frank Lloyd Wright, and many architects So looking at the Architect's Toolbox, this is a rough collection of what architects use. I've been an architect for more than 10 years, so I know about this toolbox, the software we use for the visualizations and the CAD and the 3D, turtleneck, and the measuring tape. But something maybe seems a bit odd to some of you, which is the law. And you'll see, it's included for good reason, is that architects the power to do their jobs and to do what they are aiming to shape, how they're aiming to shape the built environment. So like taking Annabel's quote on the built environment is the biggest and most artificial product. Well, this product happens through the hands of designers, architects, planners, and engineers. And it is laws that in Egypt, we have the building law, which gives architects and planners a direct and indirect influence on the livelihoods of people. First, of course, the most obvious power is the right to design buildings. And here it affects about tens to hundreds of people. Then we also have the right to replan areas, neighborhoods deemed unviable or condemned or blighted, depending on different countries use different wordings, and also to expropriate private property. Here, the level of influence grows to affect hundreds, if not thousands of people. The third level of influence is arguably the larger one, which is the power to enact, draw up, and design national, region, and local strategic socioeconomic plans. So these are plans that govern, for example, in Egypt, something like Egypt 2052, or the plans before it. They really look at the entire country, look at transport, at water resources, and different designs as how the country as a whole will actually grow, where places will have certain economic benefits, where to put different ports, different airports, and so on. So this is really the biggest type of power of all. But then going hand in hand with these powers comes also a responsibility. And this is something that a lot of people forget, is that having the right to do plans that affect tens, hundreds, or millions of people also comes with a responsibility towards them. Usually this responsibility also comes from a hierarchy of legislation, chief of which is our Constitution, where Article 78 states that the state shall ensure the citizens' right to adequate, safe, and healthy housing. And this, by definition or by implication in the work that I just mentioned, flows down to the architects and planners in order for them to do so. Another level of legislation, which is Egypt's civil code, that is really the law of the land that governs most happenings, has also stipulated on the right to private property is based on it having a social function, which the owner must fulfill. And this is really key to architects and planners as the main element that they use for design and for planning. So, and this is something else that's really forgotten or usually forgotten, is that private land is usually looked at as being the ownership of the client, whereas it also is supposed to have a social function when need be. So here, architects become a bit more like medical professionals. They are bound by the Hippocratic oath in terms of doing no harm. And we start scratching our heads, well, where is the Hippocratic oath for architects? I don't think many have heard about it. But I actually found one in our engineers syndicate, where architects are also part of the syndicate as well as planners, and they have a very advanced code of ethics that all architects and engineers must apply. One of the key elements in it, of course, is safety, public health, preserving the environment. These are all very obvious targets, but also encouraging feasible projects. So this is really important, especially in this era now of mega projects, looking at paying attention to public areas, which is another key issue and key point of contention when it comes to the idea of property and the use and commodification of land. Article 25, in a way, also related to the original Article 25, is upholding human rights while working on the basis of equality and justice for all. So all these are very bold visions that an architect and engineers must have, but we know very little about. But some have known about them, or some have applied them in their work that we also know little about. For example, in the 1940s, we have Mahmoud Riyad, who started his way up through being a low-level and then mid-level architect in a government institution, and then in 1945, in the influential Megawra-Built Environment, he wrote an essay on outlining the housing policies and more equitable housing policies that the government should be applying. And this was really, this really stood out because most architects use Megawra-Built Environment to promote themselves and their work, to publish the villas and buildings that they've designed. And it's very interesting that this is the only article that he's ever contributed, as far as my knowledge, to this magazine. And it paid off later on in 1947. One of the biggest, if not the first, social housing schemes in Egypt broke ground, and much of his ideas about how it should be managed and how it should be rented out to tenants was applied. And then a few years later, in 1950, when Egypt set up its first really precursor to the Ministry of Housing, the Department of Popular Homes, he was made director of it. So we see this example of an architect looking and critiquing the social side of architecture relatively early on. We're talking about 8 years ago. And we also see it a bit later from the 1970s with civil engineer Milad Hanna, who had a very long life and career, which spanned, in addition to being a civil engineer, being a professor of civil engineering, being a member of parliament, where he then took his critiques that he put in at least 3 books and hundreds of articles to the test. In the 1980s, he was also head of the housing committee then, where he oversaw the inaction of different laws or amendments to them. But then he also conceded that he couldn't put in his full vision for equitable homes. One of his key statements and quotes is dwellers without dwellings. And here he's talking about the rise of this vacancy and surplus of production that people could well see and well sense in the 1980s and continues in Egypt up until today. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't get the slide. So yeah, this is Milad Hanna. And to conclude, and again here to focus on the architect, but also what can be done in terms of getting architects more socially aware, and especially that we're in we're being hosted today by a center that focuses on social work that is part of academia, is our recommendations to academia and to universities to really take a good look at their curriculum that's being taught to the planners, designers, and decision makers of the future to integrate as much as they can all these elements of social design and social architecture and planning that already exists. So this doesn't need any new work or any new research. It actually exists, and it's actually in many ways binding to architects, whether it's the code of ethics, whether it's the constitution and the laws. And it is very, very key that this can easily be integrated through working on highlighting the definitions and social wording that we see in these different laws, and then taking each of them and looking at it in more detail, discussing topics such as public benefit, human rights, climate change, and then also applying them to the designs that the students work on, whether it's applying the building and planning laws, focusing more on projects that involve communities, and of course working on actual case studies where Egypt does not have any shortage of. And thank you for today. If you'd like to check our work, we have the URL up there. It was very good being here today, and Ali, I think the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yahia, for a very interesting presentation. Please, if you have questions, write your questions in the chat box or raise your hand. I have a question and a comment. The first question is about, Yahya talked about it, and I think Annabel talked about it all over the place. Now, how do you achieve human rights in built environment? If you were to advise the government about how do you achieve this, how would you go about it? I know you could write books on that. We could probably spend from here to eternity talking about it. But I could see certain elements, and I'll comment about it later on, but I want to hear your views. It's interesting to know what it is. It's interesting to know that engineers need to have a code. It's interesting to know that I need to sort of educate people in a certain thing. But when you look at it from a perspective of business and human rights in general, this is not what delivers. It helps. It creates a more hospitable or more conducive environment, but it does not deliver it. So my question to you is, how do you get it? I'm going to start with Annabel and then Yahya.
Excellent question. And I think if you're asking specifically about governments, again, everyone has their own roles to play. But on the government side, one is through both the enactment, but then also the implementation of laws. And that's where I feel like moving from the idea of rights broad commitments to human rights is breaking it down to like non-discrimination, to the right to housing. So what actively is the government doing to respect the right, for example, to adequate housing, and then recognizing that adequate housing includes provisions like affordability, cultural adequacy, quality of housing, etc. So really being sure that those are being implemented in practice. So absolutely on the legal side, and I love that Yahia went deeper really on the way in which law plays such a key piece through this, and the ways in which architects, engineers, their associations and others ideally should be pushing for stronger laws to create that enabling environment. Second, two other areas I would say is one is government oversight and accountability for actors in this sector, for example. So if speculative investments in housing, or to the extent of money laundering, is rampant in a municipality or on a national level, what is the government doing to curb that? How can it learn from other countries that have managed to balance the need for finance with the need to respect the right to adequate housing? So there's a sort of key role, I think, for governments there in terms of thinking about financial flows in the built environment. Thirdly, procurement, as I highlighted. I mean, for example, here in the United States, and then in so many other countries, as economies get back on their feet or try to after the COVID pandemic, infrastructure in the built environment is a big piece of that. And there are huge opportunities. So maybe pause, maybe go like a little bit slower, or at least to really think, what kind of infrastructure do we want? And then within those procurement contracts, how can they really be shaping the industry in a way that ensures respect for workers' rights and helps expand the space for human rights in the context of what is built. So there's huge procurement leverage there. That's 3 points of intervention. There are others as well, but I'll stop there.
Well, from my side, and yeah, I'll continue on what Annabel was talking about. Is I mean, first applying the law. I mean, like I've just shown, we have some great laws already in place. This may have not been the case 10, 15 years ago, and the fight was different, was to get the laws there. But now that we have them there, it's all down to getting them applied, and this can happen through, of course, two key things. First is awareness about them and what they actually mean, and who's supposed to do what in which part of the cycle, where the responsibilities lie. And the second part is enabling the law to actually happen through infrastructural change in terms of the judiciary, the upholding of the law itself. We have very overcrowded courts. Cases take too long, and so on. So this needs a massive overhaul in that sense. So this is one step. This, I would say, is the low-hanging fruit. The second one up from there is participation, and it's meaningful participation, community participation, on all different levels. So, and again, part of this goes back to applying the law. The building code has different aspects of participation in drawing up local plans and so on, and this is not done as much as it should be. But also then participation in changing the laws or reforming laws that are more equitable and address the inequities that we've talked about. And third is, I would focus again here on the raising awareness of the key actors involved in designing the built environment, which is architects and planners.
Yeah, and just to jump on the back of that, I thought that was excellent that you lifted up how the existing codes and commitments are pretty nicely worded, and I think there's a lot of potential for then one holding associations, planning organizations, etc. to those existing commitments and really highlighting what they mean. And then on the government side, just also the planning role, we both touched on it, but I think we shouldn't sort of lose sight of that. And I think, again, at this moment in time, when there's this emphasis both on master plans to respond to COVID or big plans that governments are putting forward, plus this emphasis on, the future city, is a key moment, again, for those professionals in architecture and engineering to be really kind of leaning into those conversations and thinking about whose voices are being heard and who's in the room.
Lovely. Thank you both. A few years back, I used to think that governance is an Egyptian problem or a developing country problem. Apparently, it's all over the place. I mean, when you look at governance, it's exactly what you guys are saying. I mean, governance is about rule of law. Governance is about equity and inclusiveness. It's about accountability. It's about transparency. It's about responsiveness, and it's about empowerment. Those are the elements of governance. I'm talking about ecosystem governance. And this is a little bit more than just government, because a big part of keeping the government at bay is having a strong civil society organization, which is most probably, I mean, we don't see it everywhere. I mean, even in developing countries, I mean, the civil society organizations the power is just eroding. Now, there is a question from Maya Abul Nasr. Maya is from the Caravan, which is the student magazine at the AUC. So I will let Maya tell her own question. Maya, please unmute and talk, my dear.
Hi.
Hi, Maya.
Hello.
Here. All right. So first of all, thank you very much for this very insightful talk. I really appreciate it. I've definitely learned things that I didn't know before. So my question is to possibly both of you, but it is a little bit more of an Egyptian case. So I would imagine Mr. Yahia would have a little bit more insight on it, perhaps, but I would appreciate insight from both of you. Anything would be great. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on the government housing projects, such as Asmarat in Egypt. Do they comply with basic human rights guidelines in terms of the way they're distributed, I suppose, or how they've been, just how it's been managed, the outcome of it?
Okay, I think, yeah, I'll answer that. Well, for any housing project to succeed in implementing or becoming adequate housing, there's at least 5 or 6 components that have to be there. So you need access to adequate water, access to jobs, being close to enough to jobs and livelihoods. You need tenure rights. So I think on a case-by-case basis, some families have that, but some don't, or have less of that. And this has to be looked at in more detail, because basically rehousing, I mean, the whole process of rehousing, and many experts have written about this from the time of the Aswan Dam and the displacement of the Nubians, is that it's one of the hardest and toughest projects to ever do, is to take out or to recreate livelihoods that were created over years, decades, or centuries, and recreate them somewhere else is really tough to do. And the scale at which it's being done now in Asmarat and other places it raises questions on how all the elements of proper livelihoods and adequate housing are addressed.
Thank you, Yahia. Okay, if you have any questions, please, again, either write it in the chat box or raise your hand. I have another comment, which is when you look at many of the major cities, you look at London, for example, look at London 300 years ago, and look at it right now, you're going to find most of the areas that used to be slums 300 years ago are currently actually elitist areas. This is a pattern that goes on and on. I mean, in Barcelona, for example, the Olympic Village was just part of the old port. This was the docks, where the workers. It was terrible, and somehow they've managed to sort of. Now we look at the pretty face. An interesting part is how do you get this pretty face? You probably had sort of, I mean, unless it is a case that it has been deserted a long time ago, which is mostly not the case. In Egypt, I think we're not seeing this yet, but I think we're starting to see it. We started to see areas, especially in downtown areas, that there is an attempt to sort of evacuate the areas and replace it with a high end. So it seems to be a story that's repeating over and over and over. And how do you make it in a way? I mean, if you think about it economically, logically, the land is very expensive. So there has to be a way to get a win-win situation to all. But it has never been the case. I just wanted to sort of pass it to you guys.
Excellent question. I think that goes to the heart of the matter. Just on Maya's question too, before, a couple of thoughts on the development of social and public housing and the scale of it. Just two sort of broad questions. I feel like two key factors are location and then finance over time. So it sounds like sort of the examples in Egypt, there are parallels too, and to lift up others, for example, in parts of Eastern Europe, where you've had ostensibly, new housing built for Roma communities, but who are outside, far outside the city. So you can have well-intentioned housing plans, which is actually kind of reinforcing existing forms of segregation. And I think also just fundamental to think not only in terms of construction of new housing, but also its upkeep over time and investment over time. So as other parts of cities might get greened and stronger energy efficiency, etc., are there existing social housing stock sort of left by the wayside and not receiving the finance that they need just for basic access to decent sanitation or heating or cooling, etc. Those key factors. On what I guess we could call a gentrification question, or that goes by lots of names, I know there are some on this call who might be deeply immersed in this area around social value, because I think the economics is like a really key part of this. I think, for example, as you mentioned Barcelona, but as other future big sporting events come up, that should always be an opportunity to really say any infrastructure or development built around those needs to be harnessed in a long-term way. Arguably, London, tried to get that right, but similar forces came into play. But I think within industry, there is a sort of growing awareness of the way that status quo financing of big projects does essentially, deepen inequality and push people out of their homes and create neighborhoods that are only accessible to a few. And there's a growing sense among parts of the industry, and I'd say particularly that goes to the point of education and sort of new architects and engineers who don't really want to be a part of that. So how can we be kind of working with like a new generation of engineers, architects, but also developers and financial people who recognize those challenges and are going to experiment with new financial models, which ultimately involves a longer term view in terms of return. So not saying I want like extortionate returns tomorrow. And there is some movement away from that, but also what are some approaches to sort of collaborative funding of projects that allow more participation, but are still, financially viable. And I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish about it because it's extremely difficult. And I think, Ali, that really is, you've hit the nail on the head in terms of the challenges, but that is the area that requires a huge amount of work.
Well, I think, to the very simple answer to this is that, in my humble opinion, the land value is largely fictitious. Land is not a product. In reality, there is no value to it. It's not something you have produced. It's something that exists there. And throughout history in different countries and cities, you see how the value of it is played with, very much more than any other, let's say, commodity or service. So this is really key, is that what sets these prices in motion, these values in motion, and how that happens. But we also need to look at housing, land and real estate and so on, less as a commodity and more as a service, at least to cover the basic needs. So when we look at it, what I'd like people, or how I'd like people to see it, is to see it the way they see education, they see healthcare. And this is what brings or makes us understand more how it's a right and not a commodity. And there is a basic, let's say, minimum that needs to be provided for, and then anything extra, yeah, that could be on the market or free to be sold, or and so on at whatever price. And here we also see the stories of different cities and how regulated or not they are. So, for example, if you look at Vienna in Austria today, more than 60% of housing is social housing. And it doesn't mean that the 60% of people are below the poverty line or low income. It's a long history of housing being part of the social welfare of the city, and the way it is built and it is managed and so on. Yes, there are still some inequities in the housing market overall, but when you see the city and even compared to other cities in Austria that don't have the same regulations in place, housing doesn't have a real market value because most of it is social. So it takes different places, different outlooks to look at and how it happens. So it is not the default or not in any way the natural progression of things that lower value areas or areas in cities are valued differently from an economic perspective.
That's it. Yeah, bringing up the example of Vienna reminds me of an event we did like earlier this year that brought together somebody from the city of Vienna, the former UN rapporteur on the right to housing, and somebody from the German Green Building Council, where they've been grappling with these similar issues within Germany. It was interesting that all three essentially were agreeing on the same point around the sort of overvaluation of land, and the need for specific strategies to be curbing that. And I think, yeah, the Vienna example, and then other local municipalities who have dealt with this in different ways in terms of saying, yeah, you know, we need investment, we need spaces, we need to build buildings, but we need to think about the city as a whole, and do it very intentionally is important. Goes back to your point, Ali, around first question, what's the role of governments? And working in that way that puts like the right to housing first is absolutely one of them.
Interesting. The same thing also is in Geneva, by the way. They also have social rental of value, similar thing. So is this something that the government designed it, or is it a community social kind of like a community representation that pressured the government to come up with this thing? I mean, how would you develop such a thing?
It definitely needs to come from, I mean, communities pushing governments, ideally, you know, and advocating for certain policies or advocating against other policies. At the same time, I know, like, for example, in the Vienna case, there was a role of public finance too, which was useful, and it's not always there. Or, for example, a big plan to kind of improve energy efficiency of the public housing or affordable housing in the city came through a strong, you know, European level grant, which obviously helped in terms of ensuring that wasn't going to exacerbate the cost of the housing. So it's multiple partners, but engagement by citizens where it's possible is an important piece of the puzzle, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, looking at Vienna and even Berlin to a large extent, they've had socialist or leftist governments for decades. So the political parties with the government, they're populated with working class and people and their opinions. So that this helps really inform policy, or at least make sure that it affects the majority of people. Even let's say neoliberal cities like New York, you still have rent control. San Francisco has housing aid to a certain extent. There are many cities that apply different forms of regulation of the market. And they're not all, let's say, the former Soviet East or and so on. So, and this really comes from pragmatic terms. If people can't live in a city, then the city loses its social value. And it becomes largely inoperable. When we look at the case, let's say, of Cairo, the problem is that even the basic level of housing is not met. So even in a so-called slum, which started out not having proper plumbing and water, you see rents rise on tenants multiple times as new infrastructure comes in, or when a road is paved and so on. So this is also a form of gentrification in a way. When a place is improved, housing becomes more expensive, whereas this improvement is just going from, let's say, below zero to zero, to the minimum, but then housing becomes expensive. So this is really the problem, where even rooms below stairs or in rooms or whatever have rental value, and people pay to live in them. So where we're starting from is really is really a tough place, and when you look at it, yeah, the dimensions are really big. But yeah, going back to, let's say, Berlin and Vienna, they haven't always had toilets and infrastructure the way we see today, and they've been largely rebuilt since the 1940s, so even much closer or newer than Cairo, for example, is.
I definitely think you're breaking down the role of finance, and the point that you made earlier, Yahia, around invisible homelessness too, and how pervasive that is in terms of people living in housing, inadequate housing, but that wouldn't necessarily be visible, apparent on the street, and how important it is to be aware of that. And here in New York, the storms that hit recently, where 13 people died, 11 of whom were living in basements, for example, is just a real, physical manifestation of the combined impacts of both climate and a housing crisis at the same time. On these strategies, just to flag also, as per that arrow that I had on one of my slides earlier around connected all the way through to very distant, I do think if we break down the types of finance that are flowing into cities and recognize, to what extent are developers kind of grouping together to become large developers, or even owned by individual private equity firms, to what extent is that model sustainable? What are the roles for curving those forms of investment within housing? Going back to the idea of just seeing housing per se as an asset is key, but also the role of pension funds and where they're putting their money. It's a bit of a kind of circle where there's all these different machines, financial machines in a way, which are involved in the built environment, but often very disconnected from the impact on people's lives. So breaking those different forms of finance down and having policies around it is key.
Lovely. I have a question from Dalia. That's going to be the last question I take. Dalia Nabil, please unmute and ask your question.
Hello, I would like to thank the speakers for their wonderful presentations. I would like to ask about two approaches. well, in Egypt, there was a ministry for informal areas that was established for a very brief time after 2011. It was dedicated for the development and the upgrading of slums area. And then suddenly it dissolved. And now we have a different approach, which is adopted where the so-called or the claimed informal areas are demolished and their dwellers are being displaced. So from your point of view, which of the two approaches is more efficient or sustainable? Thank you.
Okay. Well, when we had the Ministry of Informal Areas, it wasn't completely new. It was already the existing agency of the Informal Areas Development Fund that was turned into a ministry, and then after that it went back to being an agency that went to being part of the Ministry of Housing. And actually, about a month ago now, it's affiliated with the Prime Minister and changed its name. Overall, again, this is a problem or what we see is a difference between leadership, between the person heading the ministry at the time, Dr. Laila Skander, who had a certain view of development and not demolition, and coming up against the laws that allowed the ISDF to work through demolition that were not changed at the time and remain in place till today. So here we have the two kind of differences where you see someone willing to change and coming up against an infrastructure that is largely against that will. And yeah, I mean, this is an example of laws that need to be changed and developed in a different way.
Thank you. I think we'll wrap up. I mean, I really want to thank Annabel and Yahia. This has been really a very interesting webinar. We could have talked until tomorrow, really. There are lots of issues, lots of examples. Again, I really want to thank you for your participation, and I want to thank the audience for staying with us after the hour. We said we're going to go for an hour and a half, almost hour and a half. May Ibrashy also, I mean, she apologizes because she had really out of her control issues she could not take care of. So she could not join us today. But again, Annabel, Yahia, I really thank you for your participation.
Thanks for inviting us. Hope it's provided some challenge and nuggets of inspiration as well.
Thank you, Annabel.
Yeah, thanks, Ali. It was great being here, and the audience looks extremely interesting. So,
sure. Now, thank you everyone for participating, and please be with us next week, next Monday, September 27th. We're going to have John Fullerton, who's the founder and president of Capital Institute. His webinar, he's going to talk about Beyond Sustainability, the Rise of Regenerative Economics. This is a guy who was actually heading JP Morgan, and he left them, and he started teaching about regenerative economics. It should be very interesting, very informative. Please join us. And again, I thank the audience, and I thank the two speakers. I look forward to seeing you in many future events. Thank you.